Hello, I'm with Kamath, and this is ABPDC Motion Breakdown. Today we'll be looking at the motion for round 4 on topic area education. So, the info slide for this motion reads, School choice is the ideology that parents should have significant access to alternatives to public education for their children, such as private, selective, or religious schools. Consequently, proponents of school choice support various schemes to support parents to send their children to non-government schools, such as government funding for private schools, tax concessions for providing additional scholarships, and a relaxation of school district laws. The motion itself reads, This House opposes school choice in liberal democracies. So, let's get into it. We're going to cover three things in this breakdown. Firstly, we're going to look at what are sort of the key clashes and arguments that each side can make. Secondly, we're going to kind of look at how to put those together to form a good case. And finally, we'll talk briefly about extensions. So let's start with sort of the key clashes. So I think you can sort of break this topic down into two broad ideas to talk about. First is who gets to access this tool of school choice. The second is whether this idea of school choice is in and of itself good or bad. So let's start with that first concept on access. Side affirmative might want to say a couple of things here. Firstly, they might want to suggest that only the most heavily involved parents are likely to take advantage of any of the features of school choice that are pointed to. Things like accessing an alternate school, things like using a voucher program, sending your kid to a school in a different district, etc., etc. And that's very likely because engaging in any of those options requires you to have an awareness that those options exist, which might often not be the case, the resources to be able to take advantage of them, the time to be able to invest in all of those alternatives, and the level of care and concern about education that might not be the case for all parents, which might suggest that only a small minority are able to take advantage of this. This might be a useful claim for side affirmative to make, because one, it can restrict the size of any benefits that side negative might try and attach to this choice benefit. And secondly, it might help to argue why harms that side affirmative might try and prove to the default option, that is your local public school, might be more important than possible benefits that could arise to other parents in this debate, because far fewer people gain the benefits than would have the harms inflicted upon them. Side negative, on the other hand, might want to push back against this and suggest that, in fact, the most resourced and well-advantaged parents are the least likely to benefit from this policy because they already have so many options in the status quo. They want to send their kids to a private school, they can already afford to. If they want to engage in tutoring, they can already find ways to do that. If they want to access a school in a different school district, they have the resources to move or to rent there for a while or to work around the system in order to gain access. What this debate is actually about is taking the options that the rich have access to at the moment and providing access to those options to people who otherwise would not be able to. So the benefit of a school voucher system is felt most directly by those who are least advantaged, who have the least choice about where they go to school and are now freed up from those particular restraints. And so this debate is in fact about helping those who otherwise do not have options that the most advantaged already have access to. So I think that's sort of the broad set of arguments that might occur in this idea of who has access to school choice. The bulk of the debate then, I think, occurs around whether or not school choice is good. But that first argument is obviously quite useful for both teams, in that shaping the context in which the debate occurs, what the debate really is about, and who it is who's accessing it, provides a number of useful weighing metrics and ways in which you can shape which arguments in the debate have weight and which do not. So then, let's discuss this idea of whether or not choice is in and of itself good. There's a number of things that each side can say here. Let's start with side negative, because I think their arguments are a bit more intuitive, and many of side affirmatives are responsive to these claims. So, side negative, I think, can make a number of arguments. Firstly, they can point out that different students are, in fact, different, might have different needs, and might benefit from different forms of schooling, and therefore a one-size-fits-all system of education, where you either go to your local public school or get nothing, for those who are most disadvantaged, might be quite poor. That giving these kids the option to pick and choose, to have multiple school options, whether that be different educational styles, whether that be the choice between a religious school and a secular public school, whether that be an option like homeschooling, might be incredibly valuable, might allow kids who might otherwise not engage well in school, who might otherwise struggle at school, who are unlikely to succeed in the status quo, to have the mechanisms necessary for them to also do well at school and also be able to excel. Secondly, side negative can talk about how this might be a very useful way to unlock the powers of competition. And they can point out that the worst performing schools in the status quo might be bad, because they have no competitive pressure to force them to improve. That the kids who attend these schools are the kids with no alternatives, who don't have any lobbying power, who don't have any political capital to demand change, who aren't particularly listened to, and means that there's no way they have any capacity to influence their school or to save themselves from those failing schools. Only now, when the tyranny of, for example, district catchment areas or your own geography no longer apply, are those schools now forced to perform? But two, even if that's not the case, at least they can now go to an alternative that might be better. They can attend a school in a richer district that might be better. They can attend a school that might have a different format or might be better tailored to their own interests or their specialties, and that might be very valuable. You can point out that not only is this a mechanism for allowing the most disadvantaged to access potentially better schools, it also provides a mechanism for improving those schools that are performing worse. So even if it is a case that, for example, not everyone makes use of this additional choice, this might be an easy mechanism that you can point to explain why even those who take no action under this policy would still have ways and pathways to benefit as a result. What about side affirmative? I think side affirmative probably wants to point out that while some of these benefits are plausible, they rely on the idea that parents are both well-intentioned and discerning actors, and that there are many reasons to believe that that might not be true. Firstly, some parents who might want additional choice might want it for reasons that we would not be particularly sympathetic to. That is to say, they might want to avoid the accountability of traditional schools. They might want to indoctrinate their kids in an extreme religion. They might not want to teach their kids about things like evolution, noting that substantial educational wars were fought over issues like this in the US and whether or not evolution should even be taught in schools. Or, as we've seen more recently, it could be about issues of woke curriculums or not wanting to discuss issues like sex education or the existence of the LGBT community. Maybe public schools provide an important check and balance on the worst excesses of individual parenting and individual choice, and allowing these parents to now either homeschool their kids far more easily or reducing barriers to doing so, or allowing these parents to send their kids to more overtly religious alternate schools might be a substantial harm, not something we particularly want to countenance in this debate. It just gives these parents a greater opportunity to do harm to their kids. But secondly, even when parents are well-meaning, that doesn't necessarily mean that they would be good at telling which schools are good or bad. It can be very difficult to measure educational results, and there's a whole number of confounders that mean that information that we do have might not be very useful. How do you extract and account for the fact that richer students tend to do better, perhaps not because their schools are better, but because they have access to additional resources, because they have a different culture around education? So just because some schools seem to achieve good results does not necessarily mean that those schools are providing better education. Parents might then end up paying additional money or going to great expense and actually not benefiting as a result. Secondly, when you account for the fact that parents are often quite busy, often not particularly informed on educational policy, may be susceptible to biases, and may not be great at extracting what is often very complex data, parents might make bad choices, and there are real consequences to that. Maybe just sticking with the default option might be preferable for these parents, and we should nudge them towards doing so wherever possible. Finally, it's possible that choice may in fact result in a worsening of the school system writ large. The reason for that is something called adverse selection. Private schools, selective schools, and these other alternatives that are likely to spring up, the scholarships, etc., have incentives to skim off the most talented students because those students help their schools look better and improve their own results. The end result of that is often that state schools and public schools, and in particular the most disadvantaged state schools and public schools, are very likely to end up with the most challenged students and lose their most successful students, which means that students who have educational impairments, who have disabilities, who need additional help, are very likely to be left behind. And there's likely to be far fewer other students left at these schools. Since these kids are the hardest to educate, they require the most skilled teachers, they require additional resources, it might now be much harder to educate these kids because one, public school budgets have gotten smaller as more money is diverted to alternate forms of school choice, whether it's funding private schools, scholarships, school vouchers, or access to non-governmental schools, or just because of reduced cross-subsidization. When all of your kids are challenging kids, there might not be enough money, and when only some of those kids are challenging, and you have the capacity to take money from other pots and use that money to assist kids who might be in greatest need. So this might result in very grave harms occurring to those kids who are most desperately in need of additional resources, but are now no longer able to access them. and that could be a very big harm that side affirmative could point to in the debate. So that, I think, speaks to what the biggest set of arguments are that each team could make. But writing a good case is about a bit more than just stringing together different arguments. So let's now move on to the second part of this video, where we talk about how it is that you might want to put these arguments together. So I think the key to a good case is to be able to tell a very compelling story and to have a narrative that runs through your case and explains why it is that you're making the arguments you're making, why those arguments are winning, and why it is that those arguments make sense and should be packaged together. So let's look at how you might do that for either opening government or opening opposition. For opening government, I think the story you want to tell is one about school choice being nothing but a form of middle-class welfare. It's a way of funneling money out of public schools and away from lower class or disadvantaged students and towards the upper middle class. It's a system that's accessible only to the most advantaged and well-engaged parents who know the tips and tricks necessary to be able to extract these benefits, or to parents who are deeply engaged for perverse reasons, like the fact that they want to avoid the accountability of public schools, like the fact that they're engaged in religious indoctrination. And finally, it's a system that's very likely to critically endanger the capacity of state schools to help those who are most in need, those who won't be able to opt out of public schools, those who need assistance from the government and won't be able to get it, which is exactly why we should oppose this policy. What about opening opposition? I think the story they want to tell is a much more optimistic one. It's the idea that this is a debate about individual choice, that parents have incredibly strong incentives to see their kids succeed and are willing to put in time and effort in order to see that occur, and have the best information about what is good for their children, about what their children's preferences are, about which school would best help them succeed, and that it is wrong to deny them access to those things, that it's wrong the state public education system locks the most disadvantaged out of succeeding by keeping them in districts that continue to fail them, that we should at the very least allow these kids access to an alternative, but that very likely unlocking the forces of competition will improve schooling for everyone and provide a substantial benefit in the debate. Okay then, let's move on to the final part of this video where we'll look at extensions. So running a good extension doesn't actually require having a ton of arguments left over, being able to just run more content than your opening. The best extensions tend to be highly context specific, addressing the gaps in your opening's case and the flaws in the opposition's case. They engage strategically with the other team and make good use of weighing and impacting in order to win. As such, it's a bit difficult to really discuss what extension you should run in this debate. Obviously, it'll depend on what exactly your opening runs and what exactly the opposition teams run. But a couple of rules to keep in mind are to just make sure that you have enough ideas. You don't need, a huge number of arguments, but as long as you have kind of 5 different things in prep time that you think you could talk about, those don't need to be entire arguments. They could be different contributions, whether it's a unique impact or whether it's a set of new mechanisms to prove an argument, whatever it is, that should generally be enough to ensure that you have something left over to win the debate. So one thing to think about extension-wise is just making sure that you spent prep time thinking of enough things. And from there, what you basically want to do is track very precisely what it is that your opening has said to see what kind of material you have left over, and think very carefully about what the opposition has said and what the vulnerabilities might be there. And even if you only have 1 or 2 contributions left, and even if they don't seem like the most important contributions or the highest impact contributions, explaining why it is that those contributions do something unique in the debate, contextualizing them appropriately, and then rebutting strategically the other teams in the debate can be sufficient to win the debate. So you don't really need very many arguments if you think very carefully and cleverly around how it is that you use those extensions. Okay, that wraps up our motion breakdown. Thank you for joining me, and good luck in future rounds.